Hello, hello. I am Jess Vriesma, and welcome back to CS-252. For at least this next week, we'll be doing this kind of mini lecture format where I'll be trying to give you several mini lectures each week. Um, so today's mini lecture, number one, will focus on the command line, terminal, the console, the shell, and so on, and kind of talking about what these terms mean. Usually there will also be a little bit of reading that will be associated with this lecture that hopefully you all have read before you watch this video, and that would be underneath the subtitle on this title slide. Next, we'll have these self-check questions, and the point here is to ask you some questions that I hope will be a review for you, and if you feel comfortable with them, keep watching. And if you don't feel quite comfortable with them, then maybe you should go back and review some stuff related to those questions, and then come here, and hopefully this lecture will be more helpful for you. So for this mini lecture, the self-help question is, what is a shell? We're going to talk more about what that means, but do you basically get it? And then typically I would just ask you to pause here, think about those questions, and then if you feel comfortable with them, move on. So what we'll be talking about today is the command line, the terminal, the console, and the shell. What do these different things mean? The command line is an environment in which the user can type commands. And that's not limited to just, say, a window with white text and a black background, the stereotypical command line that you think of when you think of computer programmers. It can be for a lot of other things. So for example, in one of my favorite games of all time, called Don't Starve, you can actually access a command line which is kind of like a cheat mode, and you can do all kinds of fun things to the game. You can spawn creatures, buildings, structures, items, events, all from this kind of command line interface. Granted, it's kind of like a cheat mode or admin mode. You can do this in a lot of other games as well. If you're working on a server for some multiplayer game, oftentimes there's some kind of command line interface in which you can control the game as the administrator. But it's not limited to just games or, command lines that you program on. It's also, you can find it in things like Python. There's a command line interface for Python, or MATLAB, or Mathematica. So there's a lot of different kinds of programs where you'll encounter a command line. Consoles and terminals. Now they used to be about the same thing. A physical teletypewriter, or TTY for short, which was a device into which you would type commands. And so we get the name console from this physical, basically piece of furniture that you would type things into. And terminal came from the electronic perspective. So from the perspective of the computer, the terminal is where the computer ends and the user begins. It's the terminal or terminus, if you will. It's where the user would enter input. And so instead of it being, neurons and muscles, it would become electronic bits that would get sent to the computer. Now, old mainframes and some modern supercomputers will actually have a dedicated terminal station with a display and a keyboard. For instance, when I worked at NASA Goddard, there was one special computer in particular. It wasn't technically a terminal, but it was one computer that would control the rest of the supercomputers. And granted, you could, if you were the administrator, you could do this from anywhere. But there was one designated workstation, one monitor, one keyboard, one mouse that was set apart from all the others that was sort of a master node. And so to this day, those can often be called terminals or access points. Again, a terminal is where you access the belly of the computer, the guts of the computer, the operating system or the kernel, if you will. Now, back in the day, terminals would often have two screens, one for standard out and another one for standard error. That's why we have two different output streams for those two different things. That's a legacy feature that we get from back then. Today we have terminal emulators, and usually they're just still called terminals, but a terminal emulator is basically a program that will receive the keyboard and sometimes the mouse input from you, the user, and the terminal emulator will display stuff to the screen. So for instance, you type in a command, the shell runs it, and then it displays some output back to you. The terminal is responsible for displaying the output. It's also responsible for capturing the keystrokes that you type in and sending it to the shell. Terminal emulators today are usually responsible for capturing user keystrokes, mouse input, and out, and then they're also responsible for outputting to the screen. And they're really not responsible for much else. So they do some. The terminal emulator is the program you open when you use the command line. So for example, if you're using Windows, you might use cmd.exe. On Mac OS X, you might use terminal.app or iterm2.app. Iterm2 is what I use. And Linux, you might use Xterm, GNOME Terminal, Console, Terminator, or many others. On Windows or on Mac, you might use PuTTY to connect via SSH. All of those are examples of a terminal. It's the program that you open. It's the program that runs the window that you type things into. And all of these modern terminal emulators allow you to change things and to customize. So you can change the font, the colors. You can change the window transparency if you want to make your window semi-transparent. And you can change more things too. Most of them will let you save profiles of settings for different situations like day mode, night mode, large font mode, bluish tinted font mode, or whatever you would like. So what is a console? Now, most of the time when we talk about a console, we're basically saying a terminal, or a terminal emulator, to be more specific. But in Linux, all Linux flavors that I'm aware of come built in with a special kind of terminal emulator. That's called a console. And in this console, it's basically another screen. And so if you were to basically, like if you switch programs, like you can Alt-Tab or Command-Tab if you're a Mac user from one program to another. You can also do that with screens a lot of times. And so in Linux, you can do the same kind of thing, switch to a screen which doesn't have any windows, it doesn't have any cursor. All it is the command line. And so you can access this from whatever else you're doing, and there will always be a command line open to you without a window, without a terminal emulator. It's just the command line all by itself. And so that environment is called the console. And so you can get to that if you're using Linux by going Control-Alt-F3, and you can get right to your console. Now that only works if you're actually working at a computer. You can't really do that if you're working through an SSH terminal. But if you're actually connected to a physical, local Linux machine, you can go ahead and do that, and you'll get to the console. What about a shell? Now a shell is the command line interface that users see when they log into a terminal. What do we mean by that? So if I open up a terminal, let's say I open up PuTTY. PuTTY is the terminal emulator, and then it will connect through SSH to the thing servers. Now when it does that on the thing servers, it will then open up bash by default. Bash is the shell. Bash is the program that's running that's going to capture all of your input, and it's going to display all of the output from the commands that you type. The primary purpose of a shell is to let users run programs that they want to run. So when you connect to the thing servers, it immediately opens up a program that's going to be listening for all of the commands that you type in. I don't know if you heard that, but that's my cat saying hi in the background. So why is it called a shell? A shell wraps around the kernel of an operating system. So if you think about it, the shell is what stands between you and the operating system. If you want to talk to the operating system, you can't just be like, operating system, do this, do that, because the operating system doesn't know how to do this or that. You have to tell it how to do that. And so the shell is basically acting as the intermediary between you and the operating system. You type in commands in a human readable format, and then the shell will interpret those commands and then dispatch those commands to the operating system. So it gives you access to the operating system through the command line. So what is a Unix shell? A Unix shell is a command line interpreter that does the following things. First, it gives you an interface to the Unix operating system, like we said before in the previous slide. It also lets you run programs. So for instance, if I type mkdir, make a directory, space hi, then the shell, the Unix shell, will then say, okay, what is this command that Jess typed in? mkdir, oh, make a directory. And then space and something else, hi. It'll say, okay, the command is make dir, and then an argument, hi, was sent to that program. It'll tell the operating system to run the program make dir with the argument, hi. And then hopefully make dir knows how to handle that extra argument, hi. So it'll do that, and then it will display output from the program. So for instance, if I have a directory, if I already have a directory called hi, then makedir will say error, this directory already exists. Then bash will take that output and display it back to you through the terminal emulator. A Unix shell will also let you navigate through the file system by keeping track of your current working directory, by keeping track of what your home directory is, and letting you change directories from one to the other. It'll also let you store things in variables. Now, a shell like bash lets you define and create variables. It lets you define and create functions. And this is the basis for shell scripting, which we'll talk about in the next mini lecture or two. Finally, a shell will also perform input and output redirection. So we talked last time about piping or input-output redirection, standard out going to standard error, and vice versa. The Unix shell will let you do that. And Unix shells will also have a lot more features too. There's a whole bunch of them that you can read about if you're interested, but these are just the basics. So just to review, the terminal is the program that you open when you access the command line. The console is a specific kind of terminal in Linux, but usually when we talk about a terminal and a console, we're talking about the same thing. The command line is an interface or environment in which the user types commands. It can be through a shell. It could also be through, you can do it with lots of games. You can do it with MATLAB or Python or other programs as well. It's not just exclusive to programming. And then the shell is a program that's run by the terminal emulator that accepts and interprets your commands and then sends them to the operating system. And then it provides this command line environment so that you can Now here are some extra resources that I wanted to give you guys. It's not just like a list of references here. This is meant to be a list of links or further reading if you'd like to go a little bit deeper. I would really strongly encourage you each to choose maybe one of these, or if there's many of them, maybe two of them, and spend maybe 5 to 10 minutes skimming or perhaps reading in more detail and trying to pick up a couple things from these articles. I've selected these specifically because I think they would be useful based on what we've done here, and they give a little bit more background and depth to what I've been teaching. So that's the end of this mini lecture. I hope you've enjoyed spending your time with me. Thank you for that, and have a good rest of your day. I'll see you tomorrow.